Gotcha.
Hey, how's it going everybody? It's theGameconomist, and today we'll be taking a look at the Partizan Spear. The Partizan kind of stands out amongst other spears for having some of the halberd moveset. It has the horizontal sweeping R2, it also has spin sweep for the weapon art. Now spin sweep can be used for trading, it can be used in a true combo, and it can just kind of be used to catch opponents who are trying to roll behind you or rolling past you. Similarly, the R2 is kind of like a setup for your true combos, and it also catches opponents who are trying to roll into you. It's really useful on a spear, because normally on like the plow or the bident, opponents, what they would want to do is roll past you or roll into you, and you would kind of be in trouble because spears, they have a very narrow hitbox. If your opponent rolls to your left or your right, they're going to be out of your hitbox range, and the tracking on those spears isn't kind of good enough to keep up with that. Right? So what you do with the plow and the bident is you carry an offhand longsword to make up for that. However, that means you're only one-handing the spear. On the Partizan, you don't need to one-hand the spear and offhand a longsword. You can just two-hand it, and the unique moveset allows you to cover kind of like the horizontal area around you. So for true combos on this weapon, I know of two. The first one is it starts with the R2, then you use the first part of the weapon art, and you follow up with an R1. So R2, weapon art R1. The other true combo I know about is just R2, R2. Now, I don't know how consistent it is. I read that it only works when an opponent is caught out of their roll with the R2. Then you can just go R2, R2. However, I found that even when they weren't coming out of their roll, it appeared to true combo. It could be the case that my opponent wasn't tapping the roll button fast enough, but I didn't actually test it, so I'll leave that up to you guys to test. It looked like a true combo. It may not be. For the build, I actually went with the buff build. I generally don't recommend buff builds because buff can be countered by an opponent just playing very passively and avoiding you until the buff ends, and then they pressure you. Buff build can also be countered by just throwing a dual charm very well. However, if you're going to use a buff build, spears are a great class of weapons to use them on, because with a spear, if they try to use a dual charm, you can immediately punish it with a running attack. And it's kind of harder for your opponent to play passively against a spear. Spears are one of the better weapons in the game to sort of pressure an opponent, you know what I mean? You can come after them with running attacks, or you can roll into them and either use a rolling attack or an R2, all sorts of ways to mix up an approach. They're a terrific approaching weapon. So if you're going to use a buff build, spears are great just because you can get the most out of that buff by pressuring them, and when they do start to play passively, you'll run it back a little bit and reset your buff. It's difficult to do, but you can do it. Also on buff builds, let me recommend that you bring a second version of the weapon that's infused to faith or whatever it is you're buffing it with. I almost always use a faith buff. So you can bring like a lightning infused Partizan in case your opponent catches you off guard and you're not able to rebuff. You can just swap over to the other spear and you'll be able to make use of your point allocation. Does that make sense? For duels, I found this weapon to do pretty much what you'd expect it to do for a spear. I found that it was a highly reactive weapon. I did notice that the range was very short, and I looked it up. This is a short range spear, guys. So for spears, kind of their big advantage is their running attack, their approach, right? As well as the fact that they generally outrange a lot of weapons. Well, that's not true with the Partizan. Most weapons were outranging me, and I had to rely on the very reactive speed of the weapon. Alright, so that's actually a big kind of drawback from Partizan. That's mostly what's going to hold it back in the tier ratings is the short range. Also, the damage isn't that high, but again, I was using a buff build, and it seemed for the most part that that was doing just fine. The buff was. Opponents didn't seem to be able to counter the buff very easily. Not many people use dual charms in Arena for some reason. Maybe it's more of a very high tier kind of tournament sort of move. But even the people that did try to use a dual charm, I'm so used to free aiming in this game. It just doesn't work that well on me. Free aiming doesn't work that well. And like I said before, I would just follow up really fast to the throw and punish them for throwing. So the buff was working for me in terms of damage. I was getting up to like 500 AR, which is really nice. It really did then just come down to the short range in duels. In invasions, I didn't feel like the weapon performed quite as well as I would have liked. With it being a buffed build, I could still pressure opponents, but you can't really pressure groups as well with a buffed build. So even when you're buffed, even when you have a very fast approaching weapon, you still risk getting stagger stunned by like some poise weapons out there. That's really dangerous. So I found myself buffing the weapon and the buff would wear off, and then I'd rebuff the weapon, and eventually I'd be out of Ashen Estus because I only bring 2 with me for the invasion because I want to have enough regular Estus for healing. So the buff build was kind of a drawback. Maybe I could have done like a lightning or a dark partisan, for example. That might have helped with that. But then again, if I did like a dark partisan, I feel like the damage would kind of fall to kind of a certain mediocrity. And so that's just something you have to think about on the partisan. Short range, lower damage. You're not going to like the lower damage in invasions because you're not going to be able to punish healing as much. Also, it's not a poise weapon, so you're not able to take on groups as much. You have more risk against getting, like I said, stagger stunned by other poise weapons. So yeah, it was just okay for invasions. Definitely middle of the pack. Spears tend to do well at chasing in invasions, which is really nice. So if you're able to kind of use your environment and use the adds or support another invader, spears will do well. But if it's just you taking on a group of poise weapons, it starts to get kind of difficult at that point. Finally, for PvE, I thought this was, again, a very good weapon. You can certainly buff weapons in PvE. It's kind of tedious, but it's certainly, you know, like if you're going up against a particular boss, buffs are great against bosses, right? So you could have like a lightning partisan, and then you could have, you know, like a sharp or refined partisan and buff that, and you're good to go on the boss, right? You just swap between them depending on what kind of activity you're doing. I didn't really see any problem with this, especially if you're smart about what you bring in your offhand, a crossbow or a shield. It's going to do fine in PvE. That being said, there probably are better options for PvE in terms of both damage as well as range. So those are just, you know, the same problems occur in all 3 tier ratings, and it's just something you have to think about. Alright, well, thank you for listening, guys, and I'll see you next time.
You can't resist me! Well, if you want these lumps, you gotta put a ring on her! What the stuff are you doing? Why are you cutting my lumps?
Why, you miserable mad hollow. I trust you've learned your lesson. Help me! Very good.
Can't let you do that, Star Fox.
stay dead this time.
Nope.
I've got to use my head and think.
You know I'm a petty thief. Well, perhaps I'll go on the prowl.
You have been slain. NANI?!